Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Chaim Metzger, and we are going to be, for the first time on the podcast, focusing on the unique, innovative, and at times controversial Piskei Halacha of Rav Shlomo Goren. We're going to be looking at some more civilian-related issues, and then perhaps some of his most famous rulings, which pertain to the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli military. So, before we jump into the particulars, a little bit about Rabbi Chaim Metzger, who studied at Yeshivat Har Etzion and has a BA in physics and mathematics from YU and MAs in math and Bible. I see you didn't go down just the generic undergrad psychology route like I did. He has long sought to bring academic rigor to his Torah learning, incorporating math and teaching at Mesivta, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and using machine learning to create a predictive neural network for Tamei HaMikra, for Trup. And if it teaches me how to memorize more than one aliyah, I'll take it. By day, he is a Rebbe, a Mechanech in Efrat, and at night, he teaches Night Seder at Midreshet Amudim, a gap year program, and at the Lookstein Center of Bar Ilan. Sounds like you're quite busy, and I appreciate making time to join us. I know this has been long in the works and certainly worth the wait. So maybe just start off by telling us, before we jump into the nitty-gritty, what are the two topics and why that we're going to look at in Rav Shlomo Goren's literature. Tell us a little bit about Rav Shlomo Goren and why you chose to go down this route for our podcast together.
Thank you, Rabbi Kurtz. So when you first reached out to me, so on my head was the initial divisive split amongst, Israeli population. And, how do you deal with a split? So then in my head, I thought immediately of Rav Goren's tshuva relating to what do you do when there's a conflict between what you want to do versus what, militarily you're required to do. So that relates to a question that was asked him by the Israeli Civil Defense Force, Haga in Hebrew, where many of the members were actually religious Jews. And they posed a question to Rav Goren. Are we able to, go to defend and provide security for, let's say, a football game? By football, I mean, soccer game.
Good. We needed that translation there.
Yeah. And the question was, can they do it? As in, should they refuse the order? What should they do? So
is this a game taking place on Shabbos or just sports in general is the issue?
Friday night. It was Friday night. That's the big time game because on Friday night, Saturday everybody's off, so that was prime time.
Right.
So that was the discussion. Again, we'll get to that more in depth. And then afterwards, I realized that in addition to talking about Rav Goren, we also should realize that it's not just about divisive splits, but also that not everybody might be aware of how the Israeli army works and how the Psak Halacha around it as well. Particularly, my thought switched when I saw about a month or two ago when there was an article about how people just don't know who Rav Goren is and how the most recent entry in the Talmudic Encyclopedia on war forgot that he existed.
Wow.
So that's what
and he's like kind of one of the earliest voices on that for modern Israeli history.
Yeah. So yes, by the earliest voice on it, meaning that he's, when you're talking about the fact that there is an Israeli army, so he was with it every step of the way. So we get to, let's say, his bio. So Rav Goren was actually born Rav Shlomo Gorenchik in 1917 in Poland. Made Aliyah when he was young with his family. He ended up when he was known as a prodigy. So when he was 12, he entered the Chevron Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. And quickly rose to prominence, publishing his first book when he was 17 on a rather obscure topic of Taharot, based on the Rambam, and continued publishing thereafter. But not to say that he's a slouch. So again, this is the 1930s. So after he published that and he decided it's time to go out for college, so then he promptly on the side joined Lehi. If you've heard of that, one of the predecessors to Tzahal, one of the more, I guess aggressive would be the best term. And then eventually he switched over to the Haganah. Again, this is all while he's, while he's in university, and then while he's serving as a rabbi in various capacities. And then as things turned to 1948, so he was actually pushed by Rav Goren was actually pushed by the then Rav Rashi, Rav Maimon, also the head of the Rak at the time, to actually, not just serve as his capacity at, what he was doing, but actually to formally be accepted as the first chief rabbi of the army, right? So the Rav Tzai.
So he had to take on like a lot of, he wasn't just someone who was academically writing about military and Jewish state related issues. I mean, this was his office, right? He was serving as the chief rabbi of the military. These were lemaisa practical questions that were brought to his desk.
Right. So he had been as I mentioned, so when we're talking about what does Israel do in times of war, so he both lived it and then had to deal with it. So let's say his first, so again, initially not in formal capacity before Israel was formally a state, because then it was, nobody's actually going to anything formally because it was all underground. But then when he was formally the rabbi of the army, he had to deal with it in a systematic fashion. So, which brings us to where we're going to be discussing today. So that's from his first 25 years from 1948 till 1973. He served as the as the rabbi of the army, and he actually had the rank of major general. So as in, he was really high up, like he was a general. As in, like, not a nobody. He was, and as part of that, he also was instrumental in instituting policies that are in place till this very day in the Israeli army, in terms of, let's say, there being a kashrut, that everywhere in the army is kosher, that everybody there is Sabbath observant, the fact that all the other logistical parts. So he was involved in that, and also, let's say, in terms of the now he's one of the main jobs of the rabbinate, unfortunately, is to deal with people who passed away and recovering bodies, identifying bodies, as well as the other side of things. Let's say when you can't, or when you're trying to deal with a complicated situation of trying to allow those whose spouses passed away to remarry, the concept of agunot. So one of his earliest tshuvas are published because it was published not by him, but actually by the Chief Rabbi at the time, Rav Herzog, in 1948, relating to the freeing of the agunot, allowing them to remarry from those who passed away in Kfar Etzion, on the eve of the founding of the state. So afterwards, he'd gone back to find details about who passed away, how they passed away, and what you could do while we didn't necessarily have their bodies to be buried. And then after this long stint he had as the chief rabbi of the army, then he proceeded to become chief rabbi of Tel Aviv shortly after the 6-Day War. And then he had to become chief rabbi afterwards, and then for a decade or so. But as far as, if you want to talk about what makes Goren, if somebody isn't so into literature, you might recognize him from the photo of the 6-Day War, him holding a shofar in one hand and a sefer Torah in the other,
right.
Or may have heard the recording of him saying the Har Bayit B'Yadenu, Hakotel B'Yadenu, that Temple Mount is in our hands, that the Western Wall is in our hands, because he was part of the. Because again, he wasn't when he was a general. The general sat in the backfield, just like he was like actively involved in the wars, and he only accepted the position of being the rep of the army if the chief rep of the army, if he was going to be able to be involved in engagements.
So what I think, if I may, what I think is interesting about him is that he wasn't just simply like, a leader or charismatic, but he clearly, as you pointed out, even before he got into this whole business, writing on Taharos, he clearly had the scholarly erudition that perhaps those who are not his fans, his detractors, might not want to admit. I remember when I was in Eretz Yisrael, I went into a Svarim store in Mea Shearim, and I quasi-innocently asked to actually get Meishiv Milchamah, which is one of the Svarim we'll be referencing shortly. And the Mocher Svarim looked at me horrified, like, we don't sell that over here. And Ad Hayom Hazeh, I had to print it out off Otzar Chachma for today. Eventually, I'll get myself a hard copy next time I'm there. But I think another controversial psak of his, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot, is I'm reminded of his psak allowing Kohanim to go to medical school and to actually operate on cadavers, which created a whole brouhaha. It's supposedly what Rav Moshe and Rav Schwab are responding to in America. But he had a lot of very important psakim, not just limited to the military, but I think what we'll get to right now is just about Israeli society in general. So you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. So Pesakim, so besides this thing he wrote for the army, he also was very involved in the founding of the state. So he wrote, actually, just like he has a book on Meishiv Milchamah, which is responsive about war, he also has entire works on laws of Medina, of basically of how you should run a Jewish state. He wrote a whole book on that. He wrote entire works on Torah Refuah, which is, again, entire book about how medicine should run, which is, again, that's where that tribute was published, I believe. And also he got involved with, sometimes to detriment, with some politics, for better or for worse. So nobody would accuse him of being a pacifist or, not fighting for what he believed in, which got him into trouble a lot of the times. So if he believed something was right, he would fight for it, and even if nobody else agreed with it, which led to, at various points, splits both with people in both terms of, within when he was chief rabbi and also before. That made him a controversial figure. In fact, the fact that there's actually a term limit on being a chief rabbi. So he was the chief rabbi at the same time as Rav Yosef was. So the reason why there was a term limit of 10 years, it was invented for Rav Goren. As in, it was not, oh, we're not sure, maybe we're debating before. It was very clearly put in while he was there. And then an unfortunate byproduct was that, just like Rav Goren got capped to 10 years, so did Rav Yosef. So, as in, he definitely did a lot of things that are controversial. Some of which, one of the more controversial ones was his, we had some leniencies in conversion, as well as leniencies in terms of trying to, we mentioned before, about, let's say about Agunot. So the no longer take you for that. But he did have an example where that he got in a lot of trouble, where he was, where he was being matir Imam Zeret and Imam Zer, somebody who's questionable lineage, and he was doing his best to make sure that nobody would say that they were, to annul the first marriage of their parents. That way, it would end up being, not allowed to marry. That led to a whole, fight amongst rabbis both in Israel and outside of Israel. But that's for another time to talk about.
Right. There's a lot of different choices we could have made for an episode of Rav Goren, but I know you selected two, and as you mentioned, kind of because we were in touch with each other prior to October 7th, you were thinking about an issue about division within Eretz Yisrael, because that's when the protests for the judiciary were taking place. And then we touched base again after October 7th, when unfortunately now there's military issues that are on the forefront. And I should say that, hopefully, I know we're doing this in our, armchairs theoretically, but God willing, I mean, I'll speak for myself. You're actually in Eretz Yisrael, but I hope that somehow our learning should be a schus for our brothers who are fighting on the front lines, or sisters who are serving. So anyways, with that being said, break it down for us briefly. What are his rulings in these two chuvos, and what are the interesting points that make them unique?
Okay, so as far as these two chuvas, so they were first brought to my attention actually by Rabbi Binyamin Tabori Zatzal. So he was a Ram Yeshiva Har Tzion at the time. Again, who had an excellent series on responsa of the 20th century, landmark ones that are controversial. I've taught some classes based on his series there. You can find it online on KMTT if you
It sounds
search.
like a good resource for the podcast.
That it is. That it is. And again, he's got tons of good stuff, and also fascinating. What he can say, like he was part of the stories. So we're not talking about what about the civil defense force asking the question. So he said, yeah, he was on the civil defense force in Pardes Chana. When Rav Goren was Rav Rashi, and he's the one who asked him the question, or a group of people who were the ones asking. And so, they're saying, hey, like we're being told, like, oh, we're part of the, we're volunteers in the army, and now we're, being sent to do security on a, for a sporting event. Like this is ridiculous. Like I understand, like, and why, like, how can they send us to do this? I understand there's a real threat, and gotta deal with it. But the threat only exists because they're doing the sporting event. If they just cancel the sporting event, then that's it. So like, why don't we just say we can't go?
You're saying is
so
that that religious people should be concerned.
So Goren answered first by explaining.
So you're just saying that Dati Lumi people or religious people should be concerned that non-observant people are going to a major sporting event on Shabbos night, and it should be the responsibility of the Shabbos observant people to serve as security guards for people who are opting to, again, whether we want to call it Chil Shabbos or not, certainly not within the spirit of Shabbos, not to mention the malacha of getting to the game. That's the question. Like, why not just have the non-observant people be the security guards then?
Right. So that would be the answer, in theory, assuming infinite money and everything else, you're right to say, like, tell this sporting event, go get your own guards. Right. Nowadays, that's what you would tell them. You'd be like, we're not providing it. If you're, doing something that's illegal, etc., you've got to provide on your own. But back then, things weren't as they are now. And the reality is that if an event of such scale was happening and it got approval, then it needed to be staffed both by military and by, whatever defense is necessary needs to be there, needs to be present. And part of what they're drawing upon was the civil defense force. So they asked Rav Goren, what should we do? Should we go? So Rav Goren goes through it and explains there's two separate issues we have to deal with. One is the question of, are you allowed to guard such an event? Right? If it exists. Right? So he says, so if it exists, so he goes through saying how whether or not they're violating it, is it rabbinic, what they're violating, is it biblical? Yes, the security it's going to be biblical violations, but ways we get around that. And then in the end, he ends up saying, why there would be. And then ultimately comes the conclusion is that once it's necessary because people are there, you are required to defend them. You can't simply, when there are people who are at risk, because there's thousands of people watching at the game, and there's a risk of terror attacks and of people trying to get in who aren't supposed to be getting in. So then you have no choice but to defend it the full extent of your abilities. Like, we don't play games when there's anything going on with somebody's life at risk. And then he goes back and then he says, well, that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, you also have to realize that, so I'm going to give you a heter while you're allowed to go, no problems. You can go, and even on Shabbos, and go defend it, no problem. But on the other hand, you should take everything that you have available politically, right? Protest, push on your local representatives, pushing Knesset, make a stink of it in the press to say that this shouldn't be happening, that, force them to get their own security guards, force them to figure out on their own, because, like, this is not something okay. Right, we shouldn't be. We're a Jewish state, right? We should be following, the spirit of the laws, and you can't be forcing the military to cover up for your leisure. And so that was the two sides of that Rav Goren was arguing for.
So he seems to take this position, which, on the one hand, I could see people who are more religiously conservative would, be aghast at the idea of doing anything to help facilitate an event which is taking place on Shabbos of this nature. But on the other hand, it's not a carte blanche either. He's saying that you should still, after you're done guarding, turn around and do everything you can to ensure this doesn't happen again, which, again, those who think that Israel shouldn't be a theocracy and think it should be a secular democracy, they probably weren't happy with him. And we could see how forces probably push from both directions, which gives a little bit of an understanding of he was a man of principle, but being a man of principle means that you have to take on controversy every now and then.
Right. So I was thinking that was a good, why I thought of that one is because, like, oh, people disagree. What should you do? And people were saying, like, oh, should you refuse to go to the army for Miluim because of, your political stance? Should you pro-reform, anti-reform? And here it's like Rav Goren saying, it's like, whoa. Political, you should fight tooth and nail. But we'd never compromise on, once something's happening, we do all that we can to ensure that everybody's safe and sound, and we don't play games anymore with anybody's safety.
I see what you're saying
then,
in terms of the I remember at the time, not that, I'm not trying to make you take a position on it, but I remember the news, there are people who were saying reservists who, serve in the Air Force, which is super essential, were saying they weren't going to show up to training. And this was a huge question about, on the one hand, I want to stand up for what I believe in, not getting into what those beliefs are. But on the other hand, there is basic defense and security that is possibly being jeopardized. And Rav Goren is saying is you can't sacrifice and jeopardize security, but once you have that taken care of, then you could turn around and, well, he would say advocate for religious principles. I'm not going to get into that whole entire debate. But this now segues us to, unfortunately, post-October 7th, in which, at the time of recording, unfortunately, we are still in the midst of this long, drawn-out war. And, it's not the first time, unfortunately. In fact, I think Rav Hershel Schachter and Bikvei Hatzon, in his piece on military ethics, he describes that we're in one elongated war since 1948. And he says there's more violent times and less violent times. But he says this is all one big war that's been going on for decades now.
Right. So the part of the question when we have a war is, so what is justification for the war? Right. You're fighting. The question is like, what's going on in your mind, right? You're fighting. And it's like, okay, so now that I'm a soldier, like, what am I thinking? So for thousands of years, the answer was you didn't think about it because there was never an option. Right. So if you're looking at somebody's quoting, tshuva about going to the army, let's say, the sefer from, the Chavetz Chaim, right? They're talking about, or even like early, right, or even Rav Kook, right? They're not talking about like, a Jew joining a Jewish army. They're talking about a Jew, being conscripted sometimes forcibly against their will to fight for, the czar, for, for the king, and like often fighting really unjust wars simply because their, local, leader says, I need bodies, you're going to go out now. And you're like, what, why? So let's bring us back to, Goren's work, Shoot Meishiv Milchamah. So if you actually take a look at the, at the work itself, so the question is, where is he, what is he talking about? And why is this the name of his book? So he actually, in his introduction, he goes through explaining why, why he named it that and what it's all about. So he goes through the beginning of his introduction there, quoting that the name is from Yeshayahu Perek Chet, so for the strength of those returned from war to the gates. And so typically the way this has been interpreted, for thousands, since the time of the Gemara until mid 20th century was, from the Gemara Megillah, that right? These are the wars that people go through in terms of the war, the back and forth, the war of Torah. And then Rav Goren in his introduction is saying that's not true. As in, like, that was true for a very long time. Like, the people like, what's the shot of that pasuk? Milchamah, right? What does it mean? It means, I mean, it's like
all the, Torah, right?
What they think it means for us, right? And then Rav Goren turns around and is like, well, actually, so we have to deal with these things now. Like, we have an army, we have to defend ourselves, we have to know why and what we're doing and how, and all the implications thereof, and how can we have a army that adheres to Torah principles as best as possible. And so these shutim of his actually are, after he only formally published this when he was whatever, Rashi already, but he's publishing it after having been involved for 25 years in the various stages of the Israeli Defense Force. And that's when he's starting. So if you took a look at, let's say, the first tshuva I mentioned, the one about the Civil Defense Force, so that's actually a proper response. Right? Somebody who's in the Civil Defense Force asked him, what should we do? But if you take a look at the beginning of the response of Shoot Meishiv Milchamah, right, the first several ones are absurdly long, and they're not classic responsa. They're they basically read like Rav Goren is responding to somebody, like he's had this argument umpteen times, over the last 30 years. And he's like, okay, look, so let's just like lay this thing out. I'm going to tell you everything that I think. Here's everything, right?
These are like
Organized. What you think
manifestos.
you might want to
They're
ask about more.
treatises.
Exactly. Right. That's what he's trying to do. He's like, I know you're going to have questions like, how can we have an army? Why do we have an army? What do we do? This, that. So he's saying like, okay, so you're going to ask these questions, and now I'm going to get to every last one of them. He doesn't get to all of them, obviously, which is why there have been books, written since about military ethics, etc. But his is the seminal work on the topic. And, you can't, honestly, serve in the army. And I mean, you could actually, just part of why I felt necessary to talk about this is that, I've heard many podcasts since October 7th that people talk about like, how they fight, etc. And, I heard one podcast, somebody, who's formerly from a, grew up Haredi, grew up, basically on the other side of the political line, not Dati-Leumi, not real Zionist, but simply, extremely religious, but to the point, but are against the state and serving in the army, and contributing in that way. And and he's saying, like, he's talking about how I serve I serve in the army. I'm proud to serve in the army, but I don't keep Shabbos. He's saying and he's like in the army we don't get to keep Shabbos because we have to fight. And I'm like, and it was like, and he kept saying, I heard several different even some guys who grew up me saying that, and it was like bothering me. I'm like, you clearly haven't probably read up on the topic, because like that's
right.
just not true, right?
It's a kiyum and pikuach nefesh.
No, it's not a kiyum pikuach nefesh. That's Rav Goren's first points.
Led you right into that one.
Yeah, so it's not just pikuach nefesh.
I read the title. I read the title.
Right, so that's one people classically quote. The individual one of I'm like that you also use, let's say, for medicine, right? So people say like, like you could do it, but only when there's something actually there, right? And let's say if you look back, at the first response about, let's say, about autopsies of the Rabbi Yehuda, but he's saying like, you can't really do it because you're disgracing a dead body, and there's no immediate application for the autopsy that you're doing, the desecration of the body.
We did that episode with Rabbi R.A. Clapper quite a while back. It's a classic, right?
Okay.
But right. So let me, if I may,
there, like the reason why
the title is Heter Halachima B'Shabbos Ein Mavosis Al Pikuach Nefesh. It's a very catchy title. I mean, not catchy in the wordplay per se, but it's quite an assertion, which is that the notion of fighting on Shabbos is not Pikuach Nefesh related, right? So I walked into that trap and I said, hey, the reason that we're able to serve the army is because we're saving people's lives. And we know in general, even outside the military context, saving someone's life supersedes Shabbos. So as I like to say, time flies when you're learning Chuvos. So what exactly is his novel idea, his chiddush, if you will?
So his chiddush is that he goes back to the sources, and he doesn't simply, go off of the what we've been doing for the last, several thousand years, right? He goes back and he's like, okay, let's take a look again at the Gemaras and look at them closer, and let's see what's actually going on. So instead of saying like, functionally, well, how do we violate Shabbat in general? Why do we normally violate? We normally violate it because of, nefesh, or, for save somebody's life, or if you violate this Shabbos so that the person can celebrate many more Shabboses besides this one. And then, right, but if you actually look back at some of the Mishnayot, or some of the Gemaras, there's actually, certain, excerpts that imply something else entirely. So if you look in his entirety of it, so he comes up with his chiddush based on the Gemara in Sanhedrin, as well as in Masechet Shabbat, based on only two words basically of Beit Shammai, right? So basically the discussion of when are you allowed to lay a siege in terms of a Milchamah Reshut, again, a voluntary war, meaning a war that you're not required to do because of, either conquering the land of Israel initially, or because of, an immediate need for defense. And it says, you can't do so, unless it's 3 days before Shabbat, are you allowed to actually start a siege? And then Beit Shammai adds ad rida, right? says that, then it says no, actually you can do whenever you want because of the phrase, until the walls fall down. And the question is, so what exactly, does that mean? So, and then he goes, and then Rav Goren goes through explaining how that it's that Shammai Zaken here is actually, from that one word is actually indicating this entirely separate topic of not just of pikuach nefesh or v'chai, which normally referred to as v'chai b'hem, right? You will live on them, not die because of them. But there's a separate mitzvah of war, right? Mitzvah l'chima. There's a mitzvah to go to war for certain ends. And how does it apply even in a voluntary war? Because he says that based on the Ramban, Nachmanides, that if you're conquering the land of Israel is a mitzvah that's continuous even today.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would apply even in a voluntary war. And so once the war is starting, then you'll then be able to, or you feel that there's a need to have the war, then you can do so. And then you don't need to go into the, is Pikuach Nefesh, do I or don't I? Instead, it's not a question of really we should be doing this on Shabbos. Instead, it goes for being, so the classic nomenclature, is it
Hutro Dechuya?
Is it Hutro Dechuya, right? Right? Is it allowed? Right? Is it something that you're perfectly allowed to do, or is it just we push away the prohibition for now and let you do it? So according to the classic interpretation of v'chai b'hem, it's dechuya. We pushed it away for now. Really nothing doing here. But according to the way that there being an actual mitzvah that's pushing it out of that's superseding it, it's not just pushing out of the way temporarily. It's a full-on allowance of no, when you have to do things for war, you have to do things for war.
Right.
And
so if I may, it's not that. So it's not that you're breaking Shabbos to save people's lives. There is essentially, from the Hutcher standpoint, no Chilul Shabbos taking place. And I guess the Chiddush is that when we move from the civilian halacha almost to military halacha, I think, I didn't see if he cites it, but the Minchas Chinuch is one of the classic sources, which says that there isn't this idea of Pikuach Nefesh in war, because by definition, in war, people unfortunately die. And I seen Rav Goren's piece even gets into, how much are we willing to accept in losses, like up to 6 of the fighting force. But the idea you're saying is that it could transform into a hutra, because there's different kinds of rules for war versus when it comes to civilian matters, like we described with that sports game that was taking place on Shabbos. We have about 2 minutes left, and I was hoping if you can tell us just about this sounds like a really seminal piece. This sounds really groundbreaking and really important. And really anyone involved in knowing the laws of the state and Milchamah ought to be reading it. Yet, what happened in terms of its reception?
So many people thought that Rav Goren went too far in his statements and thought that he was, too gung-ho, pushing for a certain perspective. And as a result, basically, people didn't like what he had to say about it. So instead, they're like, well, we don't really like his read. He's, reading too much into those small sources. When let's say he's saying when he applies saying what's the current military state of things, people are like, I don't really like that either. And that's to ignore the fact that also many people who are writing are actually wouldn't serve in the war to begin with, which is a separate issue that you have to deal with. Is that he also ran into now that he initially, I said he went to, as I mentioned, he went to Yeshivat Hebron, but at a certain point, he was no longer, buddies with the rest of the rabbinate, both the Datilumi rabbinate necessarily, or for sure the more Haredi elements, and that's why they passed the law to limit his term, to limit his power, so that he would not be more influential in terms of pushing through what he's trying to push through. And as a result, many people just simply don't have access to, or they deliberately are avoiding mentioning of his Pesakim, of his rulings. So that's how, let's say, if you're looking for open practice to shoot, you're like, where's shoot Meishiv Milchamah? The answer is just not on it. So that might be because they didn't pay for the rights. To be fair, they do have his some of his Chuvot called Trumat HaGoren, which they don't know shoot Meishiv Milchamah on it. And if you were to look for, but as far as in general, people's avoidance of his Pesakim, so there are versions of Otzar Chachma, as well as other works that just simply filter out his works and don't quote them. because they feel they're too radical and they don't feel that he's part of the, part of the discussion. Such as mentioned to you the question of the Encyclopedia Talmudit had a new section on war they published. In light of the current war, and they don't mention Rav Goren a single time throughout the entirety of the
and
work.
in an encyclopedia, no less. Encyclopedia is meant to be encyclopedic. It's meant to account for all the opinions. So to say that like we're not go race Rav Goren, even to put him as a footnote in the encyclopedia, that's really something. But anyway, Rabbi Metzger, I want to thank you because here on Shoot First, Ask Questions Later, we are go race Rav Goren. I'm not saying whether you have to accept his Pesakim or not, but I certainly think that his scholarship is at least worthy of our discussion. And I want to thank you for being the first one to really bring this in a more deeper way to my attention and to many of our listeners' attention. And Hashem should just give you continued tzlacha in all of your new roles in the way that you're serving in Eretz Yisrael. And hopefully we should, God willing, hear a Yeshua hopefully very soon in our days.
Amen.